Hey. So I'll just start again. Okay. Yeah, so as I was saying, that was interesting. I wasn't sure what to expect this morning. I hadn't really come across London Federation of Housing Co-ops before Niall asked me to speak. And I'm relatively new to the sector, but not new to housing. So I've been at Co-op Homes for probably 2.5 months. And whilst I was familiar with co-ops, and I have worked with co-ops in the past, my background is in social housing. So I had spent my career working with those evil housing associations that you speak of. But no. Well, it's been interesting. I did a housing degree back in 1988 and became a housing officer in the 80s, and have been in the sector all that time. So I've seen a huge amount of change over that period. And I have, as part of the many roles that I've done, I have been responsible for various forms of resident engagement activities. And I have views about what does and doesn't work in that respect. But, the conversation you're having around the sector, the co-op sector being in decline is very pertinent, and you kind of filled in some gaps for me this morning, because my board is kind of a similar view, and a lot of the co-ops we deal with, there's different models, but a lot of them are struggling to maintain their situation. So I think the first week in the role, I was contacted by a small co-op that were saying, actually, we're just going to throw in the towel. We can't get the volunteers, we're all getting older. The properties were owned by a housing association, we're just going to become normal tenants again. And I just thought, how sad, really. And we've got to fix that. I think the conversation you've been having this morning is needs to be focused on that. And for me, it's around finding a new model rather than saying we have to keep going with the traditional model. And I think that's where the conversation should lie. There's loads of amazing examples out there of what people can do when they come together. But I think work needs to happen around taking the best thing from both models and then kind of trying some things out, really. So just kind of iterating solutions and developing models that work with the right structures in place. And I think, I think you hit the nail on the head this morning when you arrived, and you were saying actually what people need is trust and cooperation. And I think if that's absent, then you need some kind of structures in place to enable those organisations to continue to function. But there are some good bits around resident engagement in social housing. Obviously, there's kind of TMOs, which are kind of quite a different model. You talk about community land trusts not being the same. They're not the same, but actually, what can we learn from them? Are there things we can take away from them, rather than just saying, you're not interested because the model isn't the same as ours? You've got some fantastic organisations, teal organisations, so businesses that are completely flat in terms of their structure. They have no central sort of functions, but they're very dispersed, and the way that they operate is very sociocratic. So the decision making happens at a very local level, and they've got some amazing examples out there. And then you've got this kind of move recently towards common hold in the leasehold sector as well. And I think that there's so much out there that you could learn from as a sector to kind of pull together what a co-op might look like in the future. But it's about being open to learning and exploring those ideas and putting them into place in the real world. So, taking existing co-ops and trying out new things, new ways of working, and seeing what works, and if it doesn't work, change it. So I think it is about the need to be forward looking. And when I look at the sort of housing landscape today, I mean, the housing market's been broken for a long time, and it continues to struggle to provide the housing that people need. And the gap now between income and the ability to afford a home is bigger than ever. So I think and younger people are becoming much more active. They're not necessarily buying into home ownership now. So I think the time is right to have those conversations, but the model at the moment doesn't attract young people. I was really glad to hear Niall say that you had a 20-year-old that could join, but it was like, well, hey, we found a 20-year-old. Yeah. So, and I think, you know, you can't, you know, we need to create models which attract the next generation, and we need to kind of find ways of doing that. And we might not be the right people to do that because we might be too old to do it and stuck in our ways ourselves. So we need to broaden that conversation so that we can understand how young people want to operate going forward. I did have conversations with a co-op that wanted to join us recently, and they were all young. It was great. I was like, wow, this is a bit different. And but they wanted to operate in a different way, actually. They didn't want the service that we offer. A lot of you don't want the service we offer, but that is the kind of conversation that we're having internally at the moment anyway. So in order to kind of help facilitate that, I mean, I wrote to all of our chairs recently saying that we wanted to explore what they needed from us in terms of a service and what their expectations were going forward. It's a very, very difficult market to operate in. We don't really make any money out of what we do. We do it for the love and the commitment to the sector. But trying to deliver a bespoke service to 30 different organisations is practically impossible, and it's not efficient for us at all. But we want to do that. We want to kind of have something that is flexible enough and supports the sector, because we believe that by being a sustainable business ourselves, we can help co-ops to become sustainable businesses too, which is what we're here for. So I wrote to all the chairs recently to say that we want to have conversations with everyone, and we've started having those conversations now, and we're going to do a proper piece of work around breaking down what the expectations are of our service and what co-ops need going forward. And from that, we will build a model that we will be iterating as we go. We will be trying to kind of make the thing work better than it does now, because we know there's what's wrong with it. Invoices. So we've started on that journey. It's obviously being done from our perspective as an organisation that delivers services to co-ops, and in the knowledge that we know that we're not providing exactly what people need right now. That may or may not inform the conversation we need to have as a sector in terms of, you know, what does a co-op look like, but it will certainly be useful, because it will give you an idea of where, if you're doing it yourself, sourcing it to us, how some of those challenges need to be met by yourselves, if not by us. So I think it will be an interesting conversation, and we can certainly share the results of that user research with you, and use that to try and develop the services going forward. But the fundamental question I think that needs to be answered is, can you outsource without losing control, and what is it you're trying to control and why? And I think for some young people coming into the sector, they might not want to have participation in the traditional model. When I look at you guys, it reminds me of the resident engagement meetings I used to attend as the housing association director. And it only attracts a certain sort of people. The majority of our residents were young, single parents, mostly women. They never used to come to meetings. It was, the profile was very much like the people in this room. So I think that, you know, the way that you operate might have to change. And actually, I do believe you can still have complete control whilst you outsource everything. So it's not necessary to have officers doing everything, but you can still make have complete control over your housing and decisions that you make as an organisation. So I'll leave you with that thought. But it's been fascinating this morning, and I think there's lots more conversations to be had. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that, John. I'll take a question.
Yes, can Martin introduce something when he was talking that I don't really know anything about, which I should, which is the new regulatory framework. So I've been in co-ops for very many years, and I always worry about these new regulatory frameworks and things like this, because they can impose a massive outside control on what we do and how we, well, we all know what happened when they almost did away with co-ops by accident. So can you just give us a quick précis of what the likely impacts are for management co-ops, pool mutual co-ops, the different types that you...
To me, I think the best way of thinking about it is to have a proper risk map, and to understand the regulatory changes through that lens, because you need to manage the risk for you as an organisation. So it's about translating that in terms of risk. The regulatory environment is changing dramatically in a number of areas. So I'm sure that you were referring to the consumer standards.
Well, also,
but there's others
about the
well.
impact on your business, about the idea that somebody has to be a named individual in a co-op,
Yeah,
and have a housing qualification, and you cannot get around the regulation by outsource, by saying you've outsourced your management to a managing agent. That is not a duck out. So I just wonder how you think, because a lot of people might just say, well, in that case, I might as well just do it myself.
I think you've got a bit of a window there. I don't really expect everyone to be qualified straight away. The regulatory environment, though, is challenging on a number of fronts. So you've got two new regulatory bodies. You've got the building safety regulator, and then you've also got a new regulator for developers. You've got the housing ombudsman, who is got increased powers and controls and is working more closely with the regulator of social housing, and then you've got the regulator who is obviously looking at introducing a whole new wave of regulation. So the thing that you mentioned is just one element of the new consumer standards. It's all very clear, actually. If you go to the website, it is also out there if you want to kind of see what it is that they're proposing.
Well, the worst thing is that they have extensive powers at the moment. But
Yeah.
I mean, I know of individual co-op cases where actually, if they just use those powers, they could sort those co-ops out.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And they don't.
Yeah.
And
They don't,
CCH
because they have this really high threshold at the moment of it has to be kind of systemic issue, and it's affecting lots of residents. But they're doing away with that, so actually they will be able to step in. The threshold will become much lower, and they also the consumer standards became toothless basically, and they stopped regulating around for the resident, and they're just focused on governance and finance. So post-Grenfell, there's a return to beefing up the consumer standards, but also the powers and the extent to which they will or won't get involved. So these things are kind of part of the course. The standards of motherhood and nappy, they're the kind of things that you should be doing anyway as an organisation. I don't think they're outrageously controversial. The thing that does
a lot of housing associations aren't doing it.
Well, yeah, they shouldn't be controversial, but yeah, the fact that some organisations would fail those standards tomorrow is perhaps controversial in the other way. Yeah. So the standards are extensive, but they relate to the types of tenancies, the repair service, the resident engagement, empowerment. It's kind of the same kind of areas. But if you read through them, they are quite clear, and I think smaller organisations are in some cases better placed to deliver those standards than larger organisations. But it does depend if you're registered or not. If you're not registered private, then it doesn't apply to you. I think deregistration is definitely something we're looking at, but if you've got grant in your properties, then obviously there's different challenges involved.
Depends how you read the regulation.
Okay.
Also, they have no idea how much grant we've had.
Can I just remind people that if you're not using the microphones, then it may be that nobody online can hear you.
I'll shout.
It's only a button in front of you.
So this for me is where it's really important that organisations, small organisations, are able to balance their risk and their funding. So you do need a proper understanding, like, you know, as a business, you don't want to kill anyone if you don't want to go bust. So, you know, those are the two things you need to bear in mind all the time. You know, housing organisations have people who have gone bust. So, you know, there's something gone wrong.
Not many co-ops,
No, but yeah, so that's interesting, isn't it? So that's probably a good way of looking at it. But you need to kind of not get caught out. So if you end up being referred to the regulator, that's not a good look. And you need to be able to evidence what you've done as an organisation if you're going to be hauled in front of the regulator. So your record keeping becomes important. Financial viability is obviously critical. Health and safety is obviously critical. Those are kind of your red lines, if you like, and I think that as organisations you need to be actively on top of that regardless of your size, and we work with organisations who are not regulated, and it's quite scary for me as a housing professional. I look at that and think, wow, that's really scary. So get those things right, but that depends on funding. So if you do have to outsource some of that stuff because you're not a health and safety expert, you're not a fire expert, you need to be charging the rents that you need to charge. You need to be able to fund that to keep your residents safe and to keep you out of the sights of the regulator. So there's some fundamental issues, and I do think a lot of co-ops struggle with some of those things. And I can say that because I've got a housing professional hat on. It's, you know, it is a bit scary where I am.
I can say because I've been hauled in front of the regulator.
Okay, yeah.
And it's the biggest learning curve we've ever had.
Yeah,
And it basically put us on track to being the organisation we are now. It's a fantastic learning experience.
Yes, yeah.
I agree with that.
Yeah, there's nothing like,
It doesn't actually have to be a negative.
no, there's nothing like going from.
Use the microphones, yeah.
Yeah. No, it certainly focuses mine. Like, you know, having been on the end of many an inspection, it certainly does focus mine.
Right, come in with her.
You want to come in? Yeah.
Please. I mean, it's quite interesting to hear more about the regulator, because my particular co-op is one of the original pre-RTM tenant management organisations. And in London, probably half of the co-ops are actually management co-ops. And of the ones that aren't management co-ops, about half are registered. So it's about a quarter of the co-ops in London, and a much smaller proportion in terms of residents are actually affected by the regulator at all. So I know I can be a little bit lazy and let some of it shoot over my head because it just doesn't apply to us. But most of the time, it does seem like the regulator doesn't really have an awful lot of teeth. The ombudsman is more concerned with whether there's been some sort of reasonable attempt at resolving issues rather than whether you've followed their exact policies. And the sorts of issues that people are really wanting to bring up at the moment about services are really things around financial planning. It's around organising maintenance, repairs, maybe treating larger project works as a separate issue, about getting external help with allocations because they want to be seen to be avoiding nepotism. Should mention that about 12 or 13 years ago, I set up a housing co-op service provider with the intention of doing some of those services, although the focus then went on training, particularly for TMOs, and now taking minutes from an awful lot of different co-op meetings. So we have people going out, and that's the main service we do. But that's an example of the sort of thing that any co-op could do, but people just with different levels of involvement are sort of choosing they don't necessarily want to do it. There for many years, there's few TMOs, they had co-op members still handling the collection of all of the rents and the whole of their bookkeeping. Most co-ops now, I think, outsource that at least. And there's a certain level of discussion to be had about what services people are currently outsourcing, what they want to outsource. I've got a meeting later in this week where one of the themes is whether there's whether their managing agent is communicating effectively with the residents, or whether they're just treating it, the managing agent feels like they've become the general manager. And I'm going to suggest we have a little bit of a discussion around there, because some people are happy with the services they're getting. Some are sort of qualified happy overall, but feel there could be improvements. And others are out there looking to say, where can we find this? And we've always said, as London Fed, we will say these are the people that can provide these services, but we'll never give an endorsement either way. And I don't think anyone would really expect us to, but that's what I've told some of the people that are in the audience that this would be about. And even though there's fewer people here, we do have people watch these forums online afterwards. So
I think this is.
Martin?
Sorry.
I'll just say, let's be honest, these regulations have been brought in with private profile screw ups by housing associations and other, sort of Rochdale regulatory system. I say, they've had teeth, they've chosen not to use them. The regulatory framework in this country, in relation to certainly housing associations, has been not exactly light touch. Over the last few years, there's been no regulation at all, as far as I can see. So, in essence, this is a knee-jerk and panic response. And once again, the problem is we're going to be collateral damage. As I say, my coach decided to lose our house, I'm going to deregister and get out of it. But, I do think there is something to be discussed about what Greg was saying, because I would say it's actually more to be worried. And CCH had this discussion. There's discussion around CCH at the moment that the number of co-ops that are basically on the regulators' radar is likely to increase under this regulatory framework, and that's quite worrying, and especially in relation to the fact that I think it's actually worse than, because although there are a lot of TMOs in London managing co-ops, actually there are an awful lot of co-ops like mine who are proper ownership, fully mutual models, sitting on a massive amount of cash and assets. And the worry is that fundamentally, if they don't start coming onto the radar, then at some point that asset base that we currently have access to will be taken out and put into the housing association sector. So I do think we need to get this firmly on our radar and find some way of addressing it. I do think the whole argument, and I'll speak as a co-op, apart from when we had our development agent set us up, which is sold on CHS, we've never had services. We've done everything ourselves over the years, and I think we've been better for it. I'm a bit of a purist. I think if the co-op is in the position of getting somebody else to take his minutes for them, then fundamentally it needs to grow up. It's like doing the washing up or putting a Hoover around, It's bloody admin, it's housework, do it. So, I think there is a debate about the way in which, the wider argument about how self-sufficient we become. If that is still the preferred model for lots of people, then once again, I'm going back to this idea. I think co-ops should combine together to provide their own service agency, a bit like they do in Liverpool, whereby, we come together, we have our own organisation, a bit like Solon and some of the other models we run, and we own it, and we basically provide the services, and we basically, take all of the existing co-op workers and stick them in one building or something, and break their poisonous relationship with their committees, etc., and make them happy. What a payoff that would be. So, that's where I'm heading this. And again, I think it's another challenge on the horizon for us, along with, the fact that we need to get organised and have some sort of legacy, because once again, it's another threat to our existence in our sector.
Do you want to come in?
I think the conversation is very interesting. My own view is that one size certainly does not fit all, and communication is key. And if you don't say there's a problem, then how can it be resolved? Martin's view as regards being purist, I understand, it makes sense. That's what co-ops initially were brought into being to do. That's not be fair, but when you rely upon a managing agent for a full service contract, then you have to be open and transparent about what does and what doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, you have to change it. Otherwise, it is just not going to work. So I think there is a change occurring over the next couple of quarters, whereby people will have to relook at what services they provide, how much they're charging for them, whether or not it meets both the needs of the client and the managing agent, because it's a two-way street. And I think there are some very difficult discussions due to be had personally, but not to have them is not an option in my view.
Well, the regulations are getting more and more, I won't say onerous, but more and more complex. We've the new fire regulations that come in, which every co-op has to abide by. And I doubt that there's that many people out there know very much about this and about the standards they need to meet in the properties to do this. And again, Martin you make the other point about the vast quantities of cash that co-ops have. My co-op has £1 million in cash, and trying to explain to members that you need to manage this cash and that sticking it in a bank is not a very efficient or good way of managing this cash. It will decline by 10% this year. You need to have strategies of treasury management of all this money. Otherwise, it is a weakness in the co-ops, and otherwise, just say the regulator at some stage or other is going to look at this and see all these, and it's in the tens of millions. It's not, and I would say it's probably in the hundreds of millions if you add all the co-ops together. And somebody's going to look at that and say, what are they doing with that? Let's have it and we'll use it for something else. And that's just one aspect of inefficiency of co-ops. We're very efficient at collecting the rent, doing the maintenance, etc. But when it comes to all the secondary stuff, co-ops aren't very good at it. And it's also a question of educating co-op members. So you have to understand this. You have a responsibility to learn about this if you're in a co-op and managing a co-op.
I think that one of the things that I love about the co-op sector is the variety. And
Yeah.
I can understand your wanting to be purist, Martin, but I do think that, I was talking to a co-op this week who's they're very small. They've managed all their own affairs since the 1970s, but their finance person passed away, and they outsourced their finances because they didn't have the skills in-house anymore. And I think if you look at something like you're saying around the treasury skills,
Yeah.
and then you look at the kind of doing your stock condition surveys and looking at those programs, they're all quite different skill sets, and you have whole industries doing that one thing, and it's a lot to expect to have experts within the co-op that can do all of those things to the standards that are required and be up to date with all of the regulation and all of those areas. So I think for me it is about enabling those organisations to manage differently depending on what skills they have and how they work. I'm on the board of a housing association, but I don't need to be an expert in everything that we discuss at the board, because I know there's experts employed by the organisation to do that. I'm there to make decisions and to provide governance and scrutiny. So it's kind of, there's different strokes for different folks, and your size will make a difference, your geographical location will make a difference, your funding model will make a difference, your stock will make a difference. So it's, all of those things come into the mix, and I think it's about how can we provide what each individual organisation needs.
Just a question really, maybe to the points you raised about the what you do with a million quid. Do we know of any co-ops that are using that kind of asset base they've got to actually develop further property? I think we've got to that point yet, and if not, why not?
Yeah.
Because I take your point. If I was a member of a co-op that had £1 million, I'm not at all certain that the co-op as a whole would vote for a rent rise, for instance, and that'd be a problem as you've moved on, that cost rising, rent's not. So both those issues really. I mean, how do you have a rent rise when you've got £1 million sitting in the bank, and why is £1 million sitting in the bank and not being used for development?
Right, I'll answer that one. Basically, I live in Islington, or my co-op operates in Islington. £1 million does not go very far when buying property in Islington. I mean, the properties around me are about 1.5 million each. For my, that's the entire house, and that is probably about the minimum price of properties in the area I live in. So actually, £1 million, it doesn't go very far when it comes to development. And I think there's also this sort of attitude of, I'm all right, Jack. People have got the houses 30, 40 years ago, and basically they're being housed, they're happy enough with what they got. They do not see why they should buy a house for somebody else, to be honest. And then, of course, they don't realise that they have to because they should be investing using some form of treasury management. Because I reckon my co-op alone has lost £1 million in reality because they haven't invested the proper the money they have. At the moment, we're about to set up a program where we will look at bringing our properties into up to ECB, was it B standard, you know, thermal, the fabric first sort of attitude towards housing, making sure that they're warm and cozy. And at some stage, then we will sort of have solar panels and batteries. And again, look at ways we can spend the money so that we can minimize the ancillary costs to living in a house for our members as a way forward. The Waverley DA Co-op in Islington got grants to do this, and is an excellent example of this. And hopefully they'll get a few more grants in the future. But again, that's one way of spending the money. The other one could be buy a holiday home in the South Coast for your aged members where they can go and spend their last years. There's all sorts of ways of spending money and using it effectively. The key one is that people are afraid. People sort of, it's a weird sort of disconnection between, you know, if I inherited £1 million, I'd invest it. I'd have to. But if I'm in a co-op with £1 million, they want to keep it in the bank. It's insane. You wanted to come in?
I'll just say, we have investigated. We have a small car park next to the new build block of flats that was our secondary last development, and we seriously looked at developing that, and we talked to community architects and all sort of stuff. And when the community hub money was there, looking at trying to get, you know, seed money to do that. And the investigations were very interesting, but basically, we were also offered 2 infill sites by Waltham Forest. We wouldn't do anything other than a lease deal. And I said, I'm not a leaseholder, I'm a freeholder. If you want to transfer them to me, fine, but I'm not doing it on a leasehold deal. But everything we looked into did exactly what Mick said. It's very difficult to fold in a new development to an existing plot structure without fundamentally upsetting the model that we are currently all based on in relation to our rents. And yeah, let's face it, no turkeys in the vote for Christmas. So what I came to the conclusion was, and we've had these conversations in the past, is that actually the only way to do this is collectively. And again, there's been discussions, certainly with other people, certainly Martin at Bunker in Brighton, and I've had numerous conversations at CCH and other people. I mean, as Mick was saying, you know, I've got money in the bank. We have got things to do though. And retrofitting is going to be the next big thing for co-ops, etc. So there is, if we're not going to do development, there is certainly a way in which we're going to spend large amounts of money on trying to bring our properties up to standard, improving our properties. One of the things that came up for us was, we're not going to build any new properties, but then maybe we should look at ways of basically enhancing or maximising our existing properties. So one of our flats in our little block has got the loft space, which was done by the tenants on their own. So we thought about, well, why didn't we do the other 3? Yeah, that'd be quite good. So, you know, where do you get the money from that? And, you know, there's, you know, let's be totally upfront about it. We, you know, basically a very small, then 12 units, and trying to generate enough money to do something on a more sort of capital scale is a bit problematic. But actually, we had a void come up completely unexpectedly on one of our 3-bed houses. A woman who was a family member just up and skipped, just dumped the keys to the neighbour. So, you know, no one on our waiting list. We're completely sort of flummoxed. That is a golden ticket in relation to, you know, that's a 3-bed house, a garden front and back. And I think the current rent is about 90 quid a week. So how do you decide who's going to get that ticket? I had no idea how the co-op was going to solve this. And once again, it's again reliant on the process. But somebody came up with the idea of, you know, okay, since we've got no one to do it and we need some money, why don't we let it on the open market for a defined period of time to build up some money so we can do these loft conversions? And actually everyone said, yeah. And actually, given that the regulators were banging on about sweating your assets and stuff like that, I thought, even they can't moan about that. I mean, fundamentally, you know, we've got a defined business plan around it. I don't think it's totally defendable. So that's what we're doing. So, you know, it's that again, you know, you've got to think outside the box. I mean, I would bang on about the fact that I'm going to go purist. I think there are, you know, various methods. But it is this idea that we do have to start thinking. So the idea of there being some sort of collective development vehicle, you know, and this has been approached by David Rogers under, you know, years ago under the old CCH, which is that co-ops in our position you need to find ways of investing that money into something that will return. And the idea would be to invest in something that was developing new co-op units that collectively would be owned by the co-ops who you basically invested in. You get a return on them, you own the asset, and you get a return on your money. But it is about the idea of tapping into that massive amount of resource that goes across. And just think about where most of the co-ops, certainly in North London, where my experience are, been basically developed in the 70s in places that were not particularly desirable now, but are bloody desirable now, as you say. You know, Islington, you know, Shepherdess Walk, for instance, places like that. I worked for Hackney Housing Co-op, and I looked in their files once. They've got 2 gorgeous listed Georgian townhouses on Dalston Lane, which they bought from Hackney Housing Co-op, bought from Hackney Council in 1984 at 12 grand a pop. They are now valued at something like 1.5 million each. So, you know, basically, and they've got 86 other flats and houses in Clapton and Dorset. They must be sitting on at least between 60 to 100 million quid worth of property, just at current valuation, I thought. So, I think once again, it's incumbent upon us to look at finding some sorts of models and some sorts of future delivery vehicles so that actually we can provide some sort of legacy. I mean, whether, my next point would be, is whether the agencies and the whole in relation to, because let's face it, you know, historically speaking, the secondary agency network set us up, you know, that got us going. Our relationship with what was those old secondary housing co-ops used to be incredibly tight. In fact, used to provide the glue that held thing organisations like this together. I mean, at one point when I was at the board of Solon CHS between Kentish Town and Whitechapel, I literally knew one person from every individual co-op across the entire of North London. I now, apart from Richard, now hardly anybody. So, you know, I mean, finding ways in which that can be recreated again. Now, whether that's through agencies providing services, but I do think there is an agenda out on the board, which is how the relationship with us and those agencies is changing. Because, as you say, it's morphing. You are not the organisations you were when we were set up, right, etc. And renegotiating that relationship, I think, is something that's got to be taken on board. I say, as part of this other idea of trying to get us to collectively push on into the future and not squander, you know, the legacy. And I say the massive head start we got on things like, I mean, we are a fossil record of our when housing was done properly. When we weren't subsidising the mortgage market, we subsidised social housing. You know, when I first developed our 2 first properties, the grant rate was 95%. You know, and the other thing people forget is, you know, some people said to me, oh, you know, is it quite difficult? One of these new people at the launch of the Community Hub about how difficult it is to start a co-op. And I had to think back and think, well, no, actually, it wasn't that difficult. Once you got yourself organised, what people forget is, for about 5, 6, 7 year period, the old housing corporation used to have a co-ops officer, a guy called Charlie Foreman, and for a period of time, they used to top slice the ADP, the Approved Development Programme, to choose 10% for housing co-ops. So, you know, we were incredibly lucky, but also we're a demonstration of how, you know, if you chose to basically subsidise the right thing, which is social housing, tenant empowerment, and tenant control, you can actually have a real difference. You know, it's a fundamental difference to my life, the way when I walk through the door to join my housing goal. You know, and I think we do, again, have the duty, you know, to basically not squander that legacy and to pass it on. And we need to find, you know, as many partners, whether it's the agencies, whether it's doing stuff ourselves, you know, to make sure that happens. Because at the moment, I think we're in danger of losing.
Niall, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, thanks, Mick. I mean, it's a good discussion. There's lots of points, you know, we could ponder on for some time. I mean, the issue of outsourcing, I mean, I don't think there's anything in principle against it. Is there? It's really scale and size of co-ops. I mean, I think Martin said his co-op doesn't do it. It's a small co-op, isn't it, Martin? I mean, the one I'm in, it's bigger. And we've had direct labour, if you like. We've had housing workers and we've outsourced as well. I think the real issue is control. As long as the co-op feels it's still got democratic control over that process. And then, I mean, I'm sympathetic to Martin's idea as well, which he's raised a few years now, about a few co-ops getting together and see if we can generate our own in-house labour, if you like, which is partly the way it used to be done, the way councils used to do it as well for housing, where you could actually have people being young, you know, brought on as apprentices and trained up and well known to the housing co-ops and their tenants, and a pooled resource amongst several co-ops, for example. I think that makes a lot of sense. But it obviously takes some time and effort to get that off the ground. But those sort of things we can kick around. I mean, just on this regulation that people have mentioned, you know, the new regulation or by the government, how it might affect us. It'd be good if anybody's got any links, by the way, if they could give us more, somewhere we can go and see. get more information on this. I mean, on the one hand, if they've been forced to take some action because of some of the horrendous cases of like young children dying from mold and badly run housing associations, I mean, that's a good thing. If the government has been forced to take action that makes them, makes housing more decent and as a health and safety issue, of course, we want that for all our members as well. But I am concerned about the idea that, as people have said, that powers can be given to the regulator to step in if they decide that financially we're not using our resources and our assets. I think that's what people are saying that they could do. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that is worrying to me, because a lot of housing co-ops are obviously coming of age, in the sense that a lot of mortgages are being paid off, because a lot of our co-ops are set up in the late 70s and 1980s. So we are sitting on a lot of assets and some money, as well, as Mick said about his co-op. But I mean, ultimately, that should be a decision of the co-ops, what they do with that money and what they do with those assets, not the government deciding because it's pushed, or the regulator because behind it is the government, which is highly has a policy of financialization of housing and the housing market and the commercialization of it, including social housing, if they can do it. Those sorts of pressures, we have to try and withstand those pressures, but at the same time, obviously, utilize what we've got. But again, that has to be decided, by members. And I can understand the hesitancy and the conservatism with a small c, a lot of housing co-op members, because we've had to. A lot of housing co-ops have gone by the way. They no longer exist compared to 30 years ago in London and elsewhere. And that may be for all sorts of reasons, maybe not good governance, whatever. Some ran into financial problems and were put into housing associations or just wound up and so on. But I think with the ones that have continued, weathered the storm, in times when governments were less friendly towards them, for example, and when things like the local authority grant was removed, which did help set up a lot of co-ops. When those things were no longer there, I can understand why they people were lifting up the drawbridge and just deciding, well, let's just get through this and eventually we'll own our own co-ops. And then after that, I mean, in a way, as Mick said, it's sort of irrational just to sit in these assets and sit in all this money and do nothing with it, because you wouldn't do it as an individual. But I suppose what lies behind it is an understandable and natural feeling that we've got this far, let's not do anything reckless financially that could get us into trouble. If we just stay on top of this, assets as they are on our properties, then we can keep a relatively low rent. We don't have to come under those pressures and so on. But it's obviously not the correct way to look at it, because we want to expand co-ops, we want to expand our own co-ops, and we want to help others establish. And there's all sorts of ways we can do that. So that should be done and discussed by management committees. But on the other hand, I do agree, I do think that, if there's pressures now coming from government via the regulator that we should be doing all these imaginative things with our assets, and if we're not doing it, we could be penalised. If I'm reading this properly about the new legislation, well, that is worrying, because I don't think anything pro-social housing or altruistic lies behind that with this government. I think that would all be about looking at co-ops across London that will have developers, private developers, salivating at the idea of getting their hands on them, or big housing associations, which in many cases act like big business anyway. They would love to get their hands on a lot of the co-op housing, which, as Martin said, was many of them were set up previously in areas people didn't want to live in, or there was population decreases, which have become since gentrified. Property's gone up, prices have gone up, but we have to have this careful balance, not getting carried away with oh great, we've got all these assets, let's do something that's not thought through. We've got to maintain our co-ops as they are, help expand the movement, the co-op housing co-op movement, but I think it should be done on the principles of how the co-op movement developed this far. And the real issue fundamentally for me anyway is when for years now I've been in lots of bodies and the housing, at meetings of the housing co-op movement, and we've all talked about ways of trying to expand co-ops and set them up, but it always comes back to the problem of land prices. That's the real issue. That's the problem. We can, the government is throwing this and that little bits towards the housing co-op movement, but until you can have affordable land prices or some sort of subsidies for the likes of housing co-ops, which did exist in the 70s and 80s with the LAG, the grants, until you have that sort of restored, then it's very limited, even with all the assets we might own now for co-ops to expand in anywhere near the way they did in the 70s and 80s, which was quite dramatic, you know. Within a couple of decades, hundreds were established, some very small, of course, but were established right across London and across the country. So it can be done. It was done in the past. So it's not just the technical detail of what we've got and our assets and our homes and what we own. It's also a bit of campaigning, a bit of lobbying, I think, has to be part of this as well. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, cheers. Listen, I'm aware of the fact that time is moving on, and we're sort of reaching the 2-hour limit for meetings. John, do you want to make any further remarks or anything?
I can't see all of the comments, so apologies if I've not picked up anything, because I've seen them flashing up on the screen in front of me. So if there's anything there that you want me to respond to, just let me know. I think there's two things, aren't there? There's one around how to build new homes and new supply, which is run in a cooperative manner, and that's really challenging because of land prices and the lack of funding. I think that funding has been diverted towards community land trusts, and that's why they're growing at the moment. And it's not been diverted towards co-ops, and my understanding is that very few co-ops have been registered in the last 20 odd years. But the other side of it is about the stock that is already within the sector, and that not being returned to housing associations or becoming by the government some other route to just becoming social housing. And I think you could have a lot more conversations about that latter point, because you've got control there. You own the assets, you've got control over decision making, and I think in terms of the legacy discussion, I think there's so much that can be done around how those homes are kind of protected for the future. But you know, you're absolutely right what you're saying. You need to act quickly, and there's people in this room saying you've been having this conversation for a few years. You don't really have many years left to sort it out. So you know, if people do get older and they can't continue to volunteer or they pass away, that stock will just go back to social housing. It will. It'll go back via the government to housing associations. So you know, I think it could be let to other people if the model attracts people into the sector. But there are two very different types of assets. There's the assets that people own, and then there's the assets that people run as a housing company, but they don't. So it's kind of, I think there's different conversations need to happen around those three areas. It's the stock that you own and how you protect that legacy. It's the stuff you don't own and how you continue to manage that stock in a cooperative way without giving it back to whoever does own it. And then there's the development piece, which does require subsidy if you're going to have no rates. And that's a much more difficult crap.
The frightening reality, isn't it? The model protects the asset, you know, in relation to the fact we're very mutual, etc. But the real truth of it is the model's fine, but unless you've got fuel, which is the members and the people to basically do it, unless you've got the raw material, then the structure is meaningless. And you know, it is that thing of people going into a room and cooperate and trust in the process. And you know, that's where we need to put our investment in is the people, the raw material.
But also the process, because if the process doesn't work, people will be turned off. So it's about making it accessible and easy for people to be involved.
For new committee.
I've actually been
New
involved
committee, the
in
meeting
my
will be
co-op
13th
for
of
the last
June.
30 years. And the procedure's always been the same. If things are running well, people basically can't be bothered. Well, this is reality, and you have to acknowledge this, otherwise, again, you can't change it. So if things are running well, if the repairs are being done, if the rent's being collected, then the only communication that normally occurs is when things don't go correctly or right. And this is an age-old problem that we've tried to deal with, but the reality for me now is to understand that you will normally have a core group of people who care, and who care enough to invest their own time and resources into making things work and continue to work in the way that they expect them to. And that's not to be denigrated, because in a way, it is the majority relying upon the very small minority to make things continue. But that's the way it's been, as far as I can remember. No matter what incitements or offers you produce for people to get involved, if they don't want to be involved, they won't. And I would much rather have a core group of people who honestly cared, not for their own purposes, but to make sure that everybody had a decent home and a safe home to live in, than a lot of people together just because they wanted the notification that they were a board member on their CV, because that's not what I want. I want people to actually contribute properly and constructively. So I understand everything that's been said here, but I can't see anything changing because it hasn't done for the last 30 years, as far as I'm aware. But if we engage, that doesn't stop us from marketing. Please come and get involved. This is what can happen. In fact, I even wrote a piece for Co-op Homes recently, which appeared in their LinkedIn page. And there's only so much I can say, because I had to balance the fact that I'm actually quite angry at people not being involved, because they're limiting the scope of what we can do. And the very fact that I also have to deal with the reality that people have lives. And in the end, it's almost, and I've always regarded it as a privilege to be elected to the board, and it is, because I have no qualifications as regards housing. It's what I've learned, yes, over the X amount of years. But as long as the people are concerned and care about their future and the future of other people, because that's the whole point, it's a domino effect, then that's my main concern. If anybody here has any ideas on how to help other people or entice people that we haven't previously used, then I'm always happy to listen to. But it is basically what it is.
Yeah. Although you wanted to come in?
Yes, just two things, really. One on Wilfred's comment in the chat. For me, my experience is it's very true in the sense that with sometimes the fact that you get less volunteers voting to become elected onto committees, it is important that the ones that are there, if they lack experience or if they have experience, make sure that if they have a service provider, that the service provision is performance managed also by the service provider. That way you make sure that the service that is being delivered to the committee is appropriate, rather than us sometimes having to be concerned that we not only have to be involved in the day-to-day running, but that we also have to performance manage the service provider. In line with that, regarding Niall's comment, in terms of John Baldwin's comment, sorry, in terms of shaping the services that we then get or that the service provider can provide, it will be a good idea to sort of put out any survey or any questions, not just to one officer or the chair, but to put it through performance reports so that the committee as a whole can contribute, and then you get a more broader view from different sources. That's my comment.
Okay. Anybody else? In that case, I think we can wind up the forum.
So for those on the exec, the next meeting of the exec will be online on the 13th of June, a Tuesday.
Yeah.
And we said that we would retire to the Pendle Oak, which is a 2 minutes walk away, and get something to eat and a half a shandy and carry on some of these discussions.
Fine. Everybody happy? So welcome.
Sorry, I assume that you'll put, sorry. I assume that you would put this out.
Thank you very much.
As regards the Zoom facility, because I tend to work quite late. I work all over the country.
Yeah.
It will be on Zoom. It's generally the exec meetings are Zoom these days. We don't come together.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I just want to say thanks everybody for attending this meeting tonight, and it was a very interesting, fundamental discussion. Yeah,
Another day gone quick.
Yeah, and hopefully see you at the next forum. Cheers.
But thank you for inviting me.
Oh yeah, thanks. It'd be good to have a meeting at some stage. We could sort of stroll down to yours.
Yeah,
Just iron out some of this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
I say we want to keep the link with CHS. It's just that
Runs at the aging process.
when we can't, some of it's just getting access to the bank statements. And it is, I mean, we're getting slated, it's like, why don't we know who the membership is? It's like, well,
It does feel like there's two different things though. It's like you can have someone as a member, even if, you know, you don't know if they're paid or not. So, you know, you should have clear about who your members are and who they're not with the sign-up process. And then you know, you chase people for their payments outside of that.
well, some people remember for 20 years, and then they pay each year. It's knowing if they're paid or not.
But you seem to be conflating the two. Just separate it out,
Well,
and then you know who your members are, and then you've got a list of who's paid and who hasn't. You
Yeah,
chase them if they haven't paid.
We have that on a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
But it's,
But
we
you
don't-
should- But if you don't, it's a really bad impression. It's like you're a membership organisation.
Mhm.
Sit there and say we don't know who our members are because we can't see a bank statement. It seems a bit crazy.
well, so I've got a list of, yeah. It's the frustration from our point of view that we're not managing to get that.
Yeah,
Um,
you need to know someone that's paid so you can chase them. But,
Yeah.
yeah.
Sorry, can I say, nice to see you again. I thought you were going to